Welcome, everyone, to this first Zoom webinar of the spring semester. My name is John Friedman. I'm the dean here at the Watson School, and we're Brown's new policy school and university's hub for research, teaching, and public engagement on the world's most pressing policy challenges. One of the things that is so exciting about what we get to do here at the Watson School is to bring practitioners who have shaped global affairs directly into conversation here with the students and the broader community and alums. And that's exactly what we're doing this afternoon. And I'm so excited to have Ambassador Chris Hill with us for that. Ambassador Hill grew up right here in Rhode Island, and over the past 40 years has become one of the most experienced diplomats of his generation. Across his long career, he's represented the United States as ambassador to Poland, Macedonia, to South Korea, to Iraq, to Serbia. These are not sinecure posts. These are places where he was, in the thick of the diplomatic challenge in post-conflict situations, in war, and the democratic transitions across the world. He's perhaps best known as America's chief negotiator for the so-called six-party talks in North Korea, where he led efforts to address what I think is one of the most, dangerous situations with the nuclear dimension in the world. He was also a key member of Richard Holbrooke's team that negotiated the famous Dayton Peace Accords in the 90s to end the Yugoslavian wars. After leaving government service in 2010, the first time, he served as dean of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, helping to educate the next generation of policy leaders. And note that I said the first time because actually his final posting as ambassador to Serbia was after he returned to the State Department in 2022, providing him a really interesting viewpoint on today's topic about Ukraine, Russia, and the future of NATO. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to our guest this afternoon, Ambassador Hill. So let me start. You've been deeply involved in this situation in Russia, in Ukraine, and in Europe. And I just thought to kind of get everyone up to speed, if you could offer people a sense of, what's going on right now, what's the situation, how have things evolved over what is going to be soon the last 4 years of war, and then we can talk about the situation going forward.
Absolutely. First of all, let me just say to the Brown University community that I think the whole nation went through the tragedy, saw the tragedy, and you're frankly some resilience in getting through it. And I think it really speaks well of this university to get through this terrible tragedy. Let me say, too, John, you mentioned my growing up in Rhode Island, and I did go to Moses Brown School. So whenever anyone would ask me where Brown University is, I said, well, it's right next to Moses Brown. I'm not sure that helped in the directions. But turning now to your question, I think these are about as fraught times as we've seen in a long time. I think one of the main issues, of course, is the fact that we don't have the great powers in any kind of sync, in any kind of capacity to work together on issues. They used to be called the great powers in the 19th century. Now we kind of euphemistically call them the, international community. Well, it's not much of a community these days. And so I think there are huge problems right now. And to start with Ukraine is really to put your finger on the biggest of the problems. Polish foreign minister once said to me, Russia without Ukraine is Russia. Russia with Ukraine is the Soviet Union, and we don't want to have to deal with that again. And yet we see a certain ambition coming out of Moscow to sort of put the band back together and to create a kind of a very difficult security situation, not only for Europe, but a situation that obviously the Chinese are looking at very carefully. It has indeed been 4 years, almost 4 years. We're talking casualty numbers on the Russian side of something on the order of 1.2 million, but the war has not been easy on the Ukrainian side. In addition to the fact that it's kind of left the economy in some state of ruin. There have been well over 500,000 people who've been casualties in this. So this is something that I think the world cannot be indifferent to, nor can we kind of leave this alone and say, well, all wars end, so this one will too. There's got to be, I think, a real effort with the North Atlantic community to try to figure out what we can do and to work together and to make sure that in the end we can be strengthened as a result of this rather than weakened. And yet we come to another crisis, which is divergent opinions about what North Atlantic relations really mean, what NATO really means. We have a situation where many people in the U.S. look at the world and look in particular at issues like NATO and say, we've been the victims, we've been the chumps, we've put in the hardware, the money to keep our defenses up, and yet many of these countries haven't. So we've kind of been in a situation now that really has to start getting reconciled with some good hard thought. We live in this information age, and information ages are great, as is the knowledge that comes from them. But alas, we don't seem to have the wisdom that comes from the information and knowledge. And I think as a country, we need to work on that.
So you sketch out, I think, a bunch of different operating pieces of this. And so let's kind of move through this in turn. There's kind of the Ukrainian side of things. There's the Russian side of things. There's the NATO and kind of the broader European, American, North Atlantic community part of it. Let's start with Ukraine. So as you noted, this war has, at this point, I think Russia may have occupied, 18, 17, something like that % of the land. It's been a huge hit to the economy, both from a production perspective, but also just the number of people that are either in the war, in the army, or have left the country is enormous. Even suppose that there were some sort of ceasefire to end the war tomorrow. Where does Ukraine go from here? How does the world, how does the global community, the European community, the North American, North Atlantic community, how do they help Ukraine piece it back together?
Yeah, that's the key question. And interesting that you mentioned it's 18, 19%. The Russians really haven't done much in the last 3 years of this war. And what's the bitter irony of this is people talk about how many square miles of territory one side has taken over the other. But, we live in a world where it's not about the land right now. It's really about the populations. And we see a Russian population that's going down, and especially a Ukraine population that's going down. Many Ukrainians, anyone who's been in countries like Poland or in the Balkans will meet a lot of Ukrainians because a lot of them have left to escape the war. And I think to an even greater extent, that's what's going on in Russia. So how do we put this back together? I think there have been a number of efforts, especially among the major countries in Western Europe, that we need a reconstruction plan. And there's been a lot of good work done on that. But ultimately, it'll come down to the money of how to find the money and find the interest of companies in investing in Ukraine. A lot of just completely destroyed industry there. And the question is whether countries will want to go there with the interest of developing that as a market, because right now people aren't buying things and are unlikely to buy things for a while, or to develop it more as a supplier area that can help Europe overcome some of its own problems. But I have felt, having been in Serbia the last 3 years and seen all the efforts by the Europeans to come up with various plans for some kind of economic recovery, and it's going to have to involve the international finance institutions in a big way. IMF, World Bank, they're going to have to be front and center on this, because we cannot have a situation where this big hunk of territory, and I'm back to territory here. You look at a map, Ukraine's a pretty big place, and we can't have a situation where it's just left as a kind of no man's land. But just to riff on a little on your question, I think a huge issue is not only what's going to become of Ukraine, but what in the world is going to become of Russia. It's run by a 70-something-year-old leader. I might add, I have absolutely no complaints about 70-year-olds, but ones who really can't seem to think straight at this point, can't seem to see where their own interests are, and certainly can't seem to see where their future is. And so when is Russia going to kind of come back from the forest, so to speak, and rejoin the international community? No one's interested right now in having a Russia be part of the international community. And I don't think that's the first thing that's going to be on people's minds. But we don't want a situation where Russia continues to be in this state of mind, this kind of national mental breakdown that they've had because of their terrible leadership. So these are going to be huge challenges.
And we don't have to get into the exact dimensions of like what land goes where in a peace deal, but at a higher level, it seems to me like a key question here is, where is Ukraine positioned in whatever is the post-conflict settlement? And, there's extremes that people talk about on both ends, where it essentially becomes part of NATO and the EU. On the other end, it kind of essentially becomes part of some Russian sphere of influence. There's kind of Finland or other models in the middle. Like, you've been involved in a number of these types of discussions over the years. Like, where do you see this going, to balance, on the one hand, what helps Ukraine the most, but on the other hand, like, what is reasonable as an outcome or realistic to expect in a situation like this with, warring parties on the ground who have different views about this?
Well, of course, the casus belli, and I kind of flatter the Russians by giving them a singular cause for this heinous war, of course, was the idea that Ukraine might join NATO. That would be an existential danger to Russia. And by golly, they weren't going to allow that. And yet, as we see now the sort of fuzzy outlines of what could be a peace deal, I mean, putting aside some of the economic issues I mentioned a few minutes ago, when we start looking at what could be the elements, probably, and a lot of people talk about this, but we have to hear it from the Ukrainians. Probably there's going to be some kind of land for peace, to borrow a slogan from the Middle East, and the peace part of that needs to be some kind of security guarantees. Now, would those security guarantees come in the form of some kind of NATO membership or NATO commitment to Ukraine? That's probably the one thing the Russians don't want to see. I mean, if you take the idea that this is why they started the war in the first place, could it come in the form of some kind of guarantee of on the part of a kind of coalition of the willing? Germany and France and some others doing this while others don't do it. It's possible, I suppose. But I think the country that the Ukrainians would look to, if not NATO, then it should be the U.S. And then we have a question, is our country up for this? And is our administration up for this? And I don't think that question has been answered. I think the question, in my view, I think the American people collectively kind of understand this is a biggie. We don't want this happening again. There are a lot of Ukrainian Americans. I think they have some clout here, but I think a lot of Americans just see the utter injustice of what has been done to Ukraine. I mean, you don't have to be a historian to know what these kinds of issues are, going back to World War II and beyond and before. So my sense is that there has to be some kind of commitment by the United States. I think our president is a little loath to do that because, remember, his whole anthem of coming in was, no more entangling relations. So we'll have to see how that plays out. To me, if we have something where all is agreed except for a U.S. guarantee, spoken or unspoken, I like to think the American people and the administration would know what to do. But right now, I got a low batting average on that kind of thing. So, but clearly, this war has got to end. All wars do end. That's the good news about wars, but some of them take a long, long time, and 4 years is way too long, and it's continuing.
So I want to make sure we get back to the issue of NATO, of what's going on in the U.S. But before doing that, you talked about a bunch of the things that Europe might do, that Europe has been doing, and my sense is that some of these things are very public things that you read about in the newspaper because the countries want you to read about in the newspaper. Some of them may be a little bit, more under the radar. And I know from your vantage point in Serbia over the last few years, you saw a little bit of both of that. And Serbia is a country where it's not been exactly a cheerleader for Ukraine, but maybe not quite as obstructionist as people might think. And so, I'd love for you to just give us a little bit of an insight of how you saw these European efforts kind of from the inside over the last few years.
Well, I think very clearly the Europeans and the Americans saw the importance of what was going on from February 22. And a few things started happening very quickly. One of them was that NATO and NATO headquarters and NATO command centers got very involved in the war. Not only were we providing a lot of assistance, material assistance, but the training program that was started essentially under the first Trump administration, it wasn't done under the Obama administration, but during the first Trump administration, we started providing a lot of training to the Ukrainians, and they took well to training. Training is a funny thing. You can certain countries do really well. I served in Korea. Boy, you tell the Korean army what some idea, and they're on it in a New York minute. And then other armies, the South Vietnamese army comes to mind, where training didn't quite take the way it took in places like Korea. Ukrainians were very good. They absorbed it very, very well, and I think very, very effectively. I think the real problem has come as the war has continued. And, we all talk about the drone warfare, which is extremely important and quite historical in terms of what kind of war this is. But, there's also a kind of World War I aspect to this, which is a lot of heavy artillery. And what we're finding is that in the United States and in Europe, our capacity to produce huge things called 155s, which is what you put in a big artillery system, our capacity to provide those things and keep enough for ourselves in case of some eventuality was really being affected. As I recall, don't hold me to the numbers, but at one point, the French were looking at 155 production, annual production on the order of 65,000 shells. And 65,000 shells, it goes in Ukraine in a matter of weeks. So we began to look at other countries, which, as you pointed out, in the case of Serbia, not exactly a cheerleader for Ukraine. But this is where I hate to pat my back with the thought of American diplomacy, but it's not an oxymoron. We're pretty good at it, and I spent as importantly, the rest of my team in Belgrade spent a lot of time trying to convince Serbia to get on history's right side here and do the right thing with Ukraine. And so it began with some willingness to provide gifts from Serbia to Ukraine in the form of 155 shells, but it ended up with us buying a lot of things from Serbia because we couldn't find it elsewhere. Certain countries are good at this, the Czech Republic, to name one, but Serbia is also very good at this. And so we started getting Serbia on the right side of history. I made the point to the Serbs that you don't want a situation where all you're doing is providing arms. Arms should be an element of a relationship, not the end all in and of itself. You don't want the cynical comments, well, they're only in it for being arms dealers. And so I must tell you, I was very, very pleased when the president of Serbia met with Zelensky, met him first at an EU meeting. And for people who think EU meetings are kind of a waste of time, believe me, they are how you get people together. And so the president of Serbia came back and said, I was impressed by him, and we're going to meet again. And they met again and again. They've met over 6 times as of the time I left there. The wife of the president of Serbia went to Ukraine with Mrs. Zelenska and looked at orphanages and things like that. Serbia established an embassy, sent an ambassador. So we really worked that relationship with the understanding that at the end of the day, we want all the countries of Serbia, like Serbia, not to be left out in some kind of no man's land over historical issues like Kosovo, but rather to be up to speed with what is in their interests and what is in Western interests. And I think that's the way to go. My own view is we need all hands on deck here. And the idea that, well, we have problems with Serbia over their internal governance or their residual problems with Kosovo. Sorry, we've got a huge issue out there, which is Russia's effort to take over a big country and ultimately to threaten Europe, and we can't allow it. So I think diplomacy needs to be front and center. And I think we need to realize what our values are, and our values are not allowing someone to take over a place like Kosovo, like Ukraine. And so we need to stay engaged and get other countries engaged. And most importantly, in diplomacy is focus. I mean, what are your priorities? Think through what should be right at the top of that inbox. This is true for any student with homework assignments. What is the number one thing you got to deal with? And I think it was Ukraine. And I think it was a kind of mind clarifying experience to understand that whatever problems we may have with a country like Serbia, we need to work together on this number one issue.
That makes a ton of sense. So let me ask you 2 more questions. And I should say that by the time we get to the second half of the hour here, we're going to turn to live questions from the audience. And so I encourage you to put your questions in the question and answer function that you'll see on the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many of your questions, both that are coming in live and were pre-submitted as we can. So these final 2 questions center around NATO and the role of the broader security infrastructure in Europe and the North Atlantic. So I think one way of thinking about this conflict is that there's a problem in Ukraine and with Russia, and it's kind of like pretty narrowly focused around like exactly what's going on in that particular piece of territory. I think the broader way to think about it is that, wow, if we let this happen, whatever happens here is going to set a precedent for the way that the Russians might interact with other former Soviet states in the Baltic, in the Caucasus, how it might engage with other Eastern European states. We even, reports of all sorts of drones and other gray zone activity in the Baltic Sea. And so, how much do you think the way this conflict is resolved is important for setting that tone about what's acceptable and what are the guardrails around Russia's behavior and China's behavior, for that matter, going forward?
I think it's utterly important that we stay focused on what we're doing. The reason is, as you suggest, if we're not up to this challenge, and it's a huge challenge, make no mistake about it, but what is going to happen to the stands? I mean, what really is Putin's strategy just to get Ukraine and then he's happy with Ukraine? Probably not. It's probably a much broader concept of putting the Soviet Union back together. And that certainly includes these Transcaucasus countries, which have governance issues, to be sure, which have economic issues, to be sure, and which have a sense of kind of being out there in the middle of nowhere without a lot of support. And so here's where we need to, continue the assistance that we've been providing. One of the great canards in America is the idea that foreign assistance is some huge element of our federal budget, when in fact it's to the right of the decimal point. And so in saying it's a huge element, we say, well, let someone else do it. Or my favorite is, let the private sector provide assistance. In fact, the private sector and whether it's NGOs or businesses will look to the U.S. for the signal. And if we're not willing to put our own taxpayers' money toward the issue, they wonder whether it's a good investment for them. So I think it's very crucial that we be willing to provide assistance with the understanding the Ukrainians are dying in this, but provide assistance, and not just in the military sense, but also in making sure this country succeeds. I think we have done well over the years to coordinate with the Europeans. I've been in many such meetings with the Europeans, and we kind of work out a division of labor, as in, you can work on this sector. We'll see if we can work on that. Aid coordination, donor coordination is a really key element of things. And I think we've done that in Ukraine, but we're going to have a lot more of these countries to worry about, because these countries need our assistance. And again, it's easy to say, well, they're not spending it very well. We need to really, give them a little shot across the bow to tell them they've better get rid of corruption and issues like that. You bet they have to get rid of corruption. It's very hard to go up on the Hill and talk to a congressional committee when you're dealing with front page stories about corruption of the aid that you're providing. But I would argue that one of the reasons that these countries have that has to do with weak governance and weak institutions. And if you want to clear up corruption, it's not about clearing up bad people. It's about clearing up bad institutions. And I think AID and others have a pretty good track record on that. Overall, I think we speak the same language as the Europeans on this. I mean, they get accused of being more bureaucratic than we are. But, you have to go back and understand a little of the history. Why is there a European Union? It wasn't just to get rich. People misunderstood that. It was to make sure that they create systems where it's impossible for their member states to go to war with each other. It was all about Germany and France in the 1950s to make sure they would never go to war with each other again. And so, okay, they're a little inefficient in the way they do things, but there's a reason for that. And so it's very important to understand, what's going on with the other guy, and see if in understanding that the other guy may have different motivations, may have a different history, a different DNA, that you can still work things out. I hope we can just for a minute, though, mention the importance of if we don't handle this, how does it look to the Chinese? Because they are watching very carefully in a lot of different ways. They're watching certainly in terms of the military equipment. People study wars and study them carefully. They're certainly looking at how we kind of react to this from the point of view of helping the economy, et cetera, but they're really looking at our will, and are we up to this? And the moment that there's a sense that we're not going to be up to it, even worse things can happen.
So there's one final question I want to ask you, although this is also a question that's come up a number of times in kind of in the questions that people are submitting. And that really turns to the U.S. side. So in the U.S., to say that, Trump and his administration have been a shock to the NATO system is probably an understatement. But, it's not just this administration. I think there's been a broader concern about, as you said, why are we sending all this money abroad and what are we getting for it? And I wonder just, one part is the broader question of, how do we think about this type of foreign engagement and diplomacy in a more constructive way going forward in this country? But then in a narrower sense, right, it is clearly in a political sense right now, it's the Republican Party, largely led by Trump, that has turned against aid for Ukraine over the past certainly year, but really over the past, 2.5 years. And kind of interested how we think about this more from the domestic side, U.S. engagement in NATO and in the world.
Yeah, I think too often people think aid is a matter of just one's largesse and being kind and giving out money like it's Christmas bonuses or something. And really, when you talk about aid, the first question you're asking is, what's in it for us? How does this help our foreign policy? And when you are a donor, a major donor, and you're sitting with a country that you have some concerns about their behavior, you have a lot of leverage there. And I think Americans need to understand better that aid is a source of leverage, and you need leverage. I mean, the ultimate source of leverage is to send in a battalion of troops. But we don't want to do that. There are 190 countries out there. It's not a solution that works in most countries. We don't want any of these wars. But what we do want is a leverage such that a country will say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to make that institutional reform. This has happened to me sitting there with a prime minister saying, I don't want to do that. The parliament's going to give me hell tomorrow, but I'm going to do it because I value the relationship with you, with the United States. That is fundamentally important to me, and I'll get through my parliamentary struggles because I value that relationship. And this goes to this other misconception about foreign policy, that this is kind of like, buying a piece of fruit at a market. It's a transaction. It is not. It's a relationship game. After all, if you think of what diplomacy is, and there are a lot of amusing definitions of diplomacy. To me, it's quite simple. It's about getting people to do things they really don't want to do, and they don't feel they're going to be rewarded for doing them, but they know they have to do them if they value the relationship with you. And I would just want people to understand that a good relationship with a dependable United States is what it's all about. And we need to work on that dependability issue. Just one other real quick point on this idea that we've been a victim. If you look at the panoply of international organizations, whether it's the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, I can remember seeing yard signs saying U.S. out of the United Nations. It's ridiculous. The United Nations was created by us. Look at the first words of the United Nations Charter, we the people. Where do you think that came from? So I think we need to understand that we created these institutions in our own image and created them in a way that meant that we didn't have to go off to every sort of you pick a stand that has problems. So Americans need to understand that with great responsibility comes great power. And you're not going to have power without accepting responsibility.
So I want to actually open up our formal question period, actually with a question that comes from a group of Moses Brown 8th grade students who are staying after school to watch the webinar. And what they write, they're studying the war, they're studying the long history of the region, and they want to get a sense of what's the timeline for peace negotiations. Read this in the newspaper, you read that in the newspaper, and kind of what's the key barrier at this point for this conflict to end? Is it about the Ukrainians supporting a land for peace swap? Is it about, Putin and Russia finally deciding that they're willing to let enough be enough? Is it about the U.S. giving the appropriate security guarantees? Like, what's the key barrier here, and how long would you expect this is going to take?
It's really an excellent question, and not surprising that it comes from Moses Brown students. But too often, these wars, the peace settlements come at a time of utter exhaustion. And there are plenty of examples of that. And the point of utter exhaustion may not lead you to the right mechanisms for peace. I mean, usually a peace that has one side very happy or able to exact vengeance on the other side, those things don't last. It's like an unequal business deal. If you have a business deal and you pride yourself in having really snookered the other side, well, it's not going to last because sooner or later the other side isn't going to agree to it. So you got to kind of understand what the different sides really want. Sometimes sides can never get enough of what they don't really want. They think they want something and it's really not what they want. So you need to be very alert to what it is they want, and you need to be active. And to say, well, we'll just wait till they are exhausted is not the kind of activity we want. So when people talk about the Dayton Peace Accords that ended the war in Bosnia, we sat on the shoulders of other peace initiatives that were much less successful. But they were part and parcel of how we gleaned what was necessary in order to provide the different parties. So you have to be active. You have to be talking to people. We had a situation where people, when I was dealing with North Korea, I'd get all this free advice. And the advice was usually, we should not allow our diplomats to talk to the North Koreans. Well, if you don't talk to them, how are you going to know what they want? And moreover, during the Bosnian war, you'd get these admonishments. We shouldn't be talking to war criminals like Milosevic. Yes, he's a war criminal. I got no argument with that. But, you leave these guys alone for a few weeks and they're a lot more difficult to deal with after that. So I think we need to be active and engaged. But going back to the very good question posed from Moses Brown, I think it is going to be some kind of land for peace. And I think the more people kind of understand that, and the more people understand that Ukraine can't be left alone again, because that's not a situation that Ukraine's going to be able to accept, the more you get some momentum for certain ideas that will eventually be in the peace settlement. I think when it's all said and done, there'll be some land, not a lot. And, normally I would have said peace for land. That's pretty obvious. But the Russians had already taken Yalta. So, so I can well understand why no one wants to be providing them more land. But the land has to be, to me, coupled with some real assurances that will allow Ukraine a peaceful and successful future. And so I think those will be a couple of elements of it. I do not buy the argument that the Ukrainians are being stubborn. I would be stubborn as hell if I had gone through this. So that is just a factor in saying, look, they can't give any concessions until they really know in concrete terms what they're going to get. And right now, they don't really know what they're going to get.
So the next question comes from Steve Martins. And Steve's question is about NATO, and in particular, the way that NATO has expanded. So, most recently, NATO added Finland and Sweden, which kind of pull NATO literally up to Russia's doorstep in the north. And, this is, just to add to Steve's question, right, this is actually the continuation of a much longer pattern where, there's a debate in the 90s about, is it wise to bring the Baltic states in, to bring the Eastern European, how much to expand? And so, the question is, does this type of expansion of NATO, is it, on the one hand, helpful in providing some security in a way that would deter Russia, or to what extent does it, create these security dilemmas where in an attempt for countries that are our allies to feel secure, it makes Russia feel less secure, and then it generates more risk of conflict down the road?
I understand what's behind that question because it does make Russia less assured. And it's also a fact that it's left Russia feeling more exposed to NATO. Now, I don't think NATO has been or ever will be a belligerent force that goes and conquers others. But I can see why a Russian looks at that with great anger and with a sense that the situation is worse for them. But, and this is a very important but, as they usually are, these countries, NATO didn't go out and force or cajole these countries in. These countries wanted to be in NATO, Sweden and Finland. And if you look at a map, you can see why. And so I think it's something maybe the Russians should have given a little thought to before they started this mess. And that's kind of an admonishing note to them. But they need to understand that when you start things like this, don't think you know where they're going to end, and they may well not end in your favor. So, yes, this is problematic for the Russians, but And I don't have a time machine for them. So they're going to have to kind of work this through. They're going to have to try to work out good relations with these countries and stop sending drones and other tests against them, whether it's Poland or these two new members of NATO. So the Russians have really, it's hard to tell a country what your real interests are. But Russia needs to understand that when you treat people like this is often what you're going to end up with. And so I'm sorry, Russia, but I think you should have given that some thought earlier.
And, this is not formally part of NATO, but, another related question comes from Eric Vartani, who asks about some of the recent Trump brokered agreements and between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so, do you see that as at all connected, trying to kind of pry those states away from some of the Russian sphere of influence as they would see it, or is this kind of trying to put some organization on something that's not as closely connected in the world?
I think with those countries, I don't think the Russians have treated them very well. And I think their interference in their internal affairs has increased. I think the Russian efforts to destabilize and ultimately change the orientation of states such as Georgia is something we're seeing now. So if I were the Russians, I'd try to think this through a little better because, one, I think these countries need Russia, and that should be helpful to Russia. Two, I think NATO does have a concept of being overexposed if it looked at memberships that far east. And so I think Russia has some time, but if Russia behaves like this, there's not a lot you can, it's hard to help people when they can't help themselves. And I think the Russians have taken a kind of belligerent, condescending attitude to some of these countries, and I think they're creating their own historical problems. People always talk about Russia as the great chess players. I don't see it. I really don't see it. They seem to, at times, to stop their troops in 1944 and allow the Wehrmacht to destroy Warsaw and then come in a month after, 2 months after they destroyed Warsaw and not expect the Poles to never, ever be a friend of Russia was, come on, Russians, you can think that move through. So, I think they've got a little time with the Caucasus and others, but they're going to have to put on their thinking caps and maybe think a little differently as well.
That's interesting. So another question comes in from Jim Head in the chat, and he brings in a different kind of, we've not talked about as much as the domestic Russian environment here. And, he notes that he had a Zoom session with a professional colleague in Moscow this morning who reported that there's much less kind of war hysteria in the Russian media. There seems the tone is, angling towards an end pretty soon. And he was wondering kind of, how do you interpret this? Is this something that is, how do you read the tea leaves here? Is this a real signal, or is this is that not a reliable barometer of where you think Putin and the Russian government are headed?
Well, it's probably not a reliable barometer. However, at some point, there is going to be a sense that we're in over our heads and we've got to do something about this. And what I would not want to see is for us to miss out on opportunities when they are available. So my reaction to it might be filled with skepticism, but I would also want to know more about it and make sure that if there's something there that we've picked up on it. And what I don't want is a situation where, wars are never a time to get people to think straight necessarily. And, once people put their war paint on, it's kind of difficult to think clearly about these things. But, this war has got to end, and not just for Russia's sake. This war has got to end for our sake and the sake of North Atlantic and the sake of Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would hope that we follow up on those things. Not everything in diplomacy, by the way, has to be on social media, I might add. I really think there's a great scope for doing things quietly, for having back channels. Generally, back channels are where you get ideas that where someone is empowered to say, if we did X, would you do Y? I can't make a commitment that we'll do X. And then you can have those kinds of discussions, because wars do end, and they usually end through some mechanisms of communication that may not be spread out all over Facebook.
So I want to now pull in two questions that are related here. So first, Victoria Richter asks about what are the conditions or processes that will be needed, not just for a ceasefire that gets the fighting to stop now, but for a feasible and lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine. And that relates to another question from Hope Dillon Jones, who goes back 30 years and notes that we kind of tried this once in the Budapest Memorandum, where Russia and the U.S. guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty in exchange for them giving up nuclear weapons. And looking back from the vantage point today, that does not seem to have been particularly successful in deterring things. And so, how do we set this up? Once we can get the war to stop, how do we set this up in a way that, looking back 30 years from now, we will really have accomplished what we're going, and we don't just have another one of these in, 2050?
When we got to the end of the Bosnian War, so much bitterness, 200,000 civilians, killed. And when we got to the end of that, we realized we had NATO. We had the United Nations forces in Bosnia, and their purpose was to keep the peace, but there was no peace to keep. But because it was such a carefully written, and I give a lot of credit to the Brown University graduate Dick Holbrook for doing this, it was carefully done such that by the time we got to sending a force in there, NATO, we really needed more of a UN force. So whereas when we had the UN, we needed NATO. And when we had NATO in there, we really could have done just with guys with pale blue helmets on or baseball caps. So the bitterness of this struggle in Ukraine, I think, is going to require some kind of lines of separation and some kind of robust force that is capable of defending itself, but capable of dealing with ceasefire violations. So I think one of the most difficult things will be to find no-kidding countries that are willing to put their effort and put their soldiers, sometimes risking their lives, as we've done elsewhere, and to make sure that the peacekeeping is robust and no one wants to mess around with it. I find that in wars, no one wants to be the last person to die in a war. So, that's why when you do get to a ceasefire, if the ceasefire is buttressed with enough negotiation where people know what their lives are going to look like when they wake up in the morning, they know who's going to be in charge of that town and how the processes are going to be working, people won't want to violate the ceasefire. So when you just sort of go for a ceasefire and you don't have the panoply of organizational strength and institutions, et cetera, behind it, people might want to cheat on the ceasefire, and that's when you get people killed. So I hope that when this war ends, you will get a situation where everyone knows this is it. This is it. And you'll have a robust peacekeeping force in there with a mandate that if you mess around with them, well, you'll wish you hadn't. So it'll look something like that. And then gradually, as people begin to believe in the institutions that have been created, the overall arrangements, you can make the peacekeepers smaller and smaller. But I would just argue against having a ceasefire and then trying to think of what you're going to do afterwards. Really go for the heart of the problem first.
So Tina Lawless writes, I think, another quite interesting question in the chat. And her question is what can the West give Putin that would not make him kind of feel like a loser in the deal and make him more willing to make peace? And actually, there's a parallel I want to draw here. Maybe, I remember reading some of the memoirs that Jim Baker or Brent Scowcroft and George Bush wrote about how they really thought about this in the 1990s, about like trying to usher the end of the Soviet Union in a way that like didn't make people in those countries feel like, the West was kind of dancing on the graves, because they just felt like that was counterproductive in the moment, even if that's might have been the way they were feeling inside. And so I'm interested, again, when you kind of get to the point of trying to kind of get to the end here, like what are the dynamics and how do you, give Putin, who is kind of loathsome as a national leader, a way to something to stay in it?
Yeah, that's absolutely the core of the issues. There's no question in the 1990s there was a certain amount of triumphalism, certain amount of end zone dancing, if I can be permitted a football metaphor for another week and a half. And I am not going to say that's what caused this hideous regime in Moscow today, but it didn't help. So I think some serious thought given to that would be in order. Certainly, there's a whole panoply of sanctions that could be looked at that if the Russians are interested in playing ball, they could see some improvement in their economy as a result of sanctions relief. I wouldn't leap at it until we have some clear understanding. And by the way, sequencing of these issues is always tough because everyone wants their issues first. So you got to do some careful sequencing, but I'm sure sanctions would be necessary. Sanctions relief would be necessary. A big, tough issue is the question of war crimes, because this has been full of war crimes. I mean, if and they're tough to accomplish when you don't. If you have one side vanquished and the other side's a winner, okay, you can have Nuremberg and you can get going on all that. If you have both sides trying to claim some kind of victory, then it's going to be tough. And yet, if you don't have war crimes trials, you will have a situation where there's no justice, and when there's no justice, the war won't end. So it's going to be a very tough issue to pull that off. Ideally, you want countries themselves trying their own war criminals rather than some international tribunal. I think it's going to be a cold day, and where, if I don't mean to allude to the weather, but it's going to be a cold day in hell before the Russians say, okay, we'll do our war crimes, and that would be acceptable. So war crimes, the point of war crime tribunals was to take guilt from a people and put it on the head of an individual. Alas, they often kind of work differently. So we've got to think through how that would work, understanding that it's necessary, but understanding if poorly done, it could just, not contribute to a peace. So I'll go back to an earlier comment. We need some smart people dealing with this.
So let me ask kind of the final question, which is short, but I think really gets to the heart of a lot of the broader implications of this in the situation of Ukraine and elsewhere. Lawrence Carson asks, will the Europeans really ever trust the U.S. again?
um, ever, never is a long time.
Ever's a long time, but have we done, have we set up a situation where, because of the, last year and a half on Ukraine, and, we could add a lengthy list of this point in Greenland and other Venezuela and other places, have we landed in a place where we've, gotten over that tipping point where it's no longer about, well, we don't always agree on stuff, but we really kind of fundamentally damaged the trust of the last 80 years in a way that will reverberate in serious ways going forward?
I would suggest everyone read, and then read again and again, Mark Carney's speech at Davos, where he talked about the change, the real change in the situation. I'm of the view that the U.S. in its configuration is a necessary element in peace and security in the world. If we didn't have a U.S. out there, we'd have to invent one. I'm of the view that as much as countries, and I completely understand it today, would say we can't trust them, I'm of the view that at some point they will feel they have to. But I think a lot of that is going to depend on us. And, getting Americans to look in the mirror, getting Americans to be introspective, getting Americans to be a little more honest about how we've behaved at times, to allude to Carney's speech, I think is the order of the day for us as a country. And the extent to which we are prepared to do that, I think we can hasten the day when we can have this reconciliation that, as your questioner implied, could be a long time in coming.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. So, Ambassador Hill, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of you out there for joining us this afternoon. Keep an eye out. This is the first of what I hope will be several of these web events. And we also, as an advertisement, we're super excited that Ambassador Hill will be joining us as teaching and part of our program next year. So look forward to hearing lots more wise assessments about the world from you too. So thank you, and thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
John, real pleasure. Thank you very much. Stay warm.